As we move into our unit on capitalism and the economy, I want to start off with a fairly broad question. How many different economic forms have existed throughout history? If you think about it, the short answer is quite a lot. Let's talk about just a few common or large-scale examples. One form that we've seen historically is what we call feudalism. In feudalism, land is the primary economic resource, and some people own the land and other people work the land, but everyone is tied in some way to that land. Another economic system that we have seen is slavery. In slavery, some people are the private property of other people. And now this can range from absolute ownership to forms of indentured servitude, but in this situation we have human beings as one of the primary economic resources. Another economic system that we've seen historically, and that still exists in some forms in certain parts of the world today, although not much, is what we would call hunter-gatherer, or sometimes called subsistence economies. These are economic arrangements in which production is simply for the direct consumption of the producers themselves. In other words, things that are produced are consumed by the very people who produce it. Often this is characterized by small groups, high levels of sharing within the community, high levels of sharing among work, and high levels of sharing among the produced elements from that work. Another form of economic system, which we see in many places today, is capitalism. And I'll just leave that there because we're going to be talking about capitalism more in a moment. And then another major system that we've seen is what is called socialism. Socialism is a system in which production is based upon common or collective ownership. Now, I'm going to say more about socialism in class, but for the moment what I want to note is that socialism is not the same thing as communism. We often conflate these two things, and there is a relationship, but socialism, like capitalism, actually refers only to an economic system, while communism, and its polar opposite, fascism, refers to a complete economic and governmental system. So these are not the same things here. And what I want to note is that socialism, like capitalism, can exist in conjunction with a variety of different political forms. Another thing to note looking at this entire list is that this is not a comprehensive list. There are other forms of economic systems that have existed and that do exist, but these are perhaps some of the most broad types. It's also worth noting that there are lots of variations within each of these types, so none of these has a single way that it exists. We can think of these as ideal general types, but there's lots of variation within each. So what kind of system do we have in the US? Well, we are a predominantly capitalist system. However, as we will see when we get into class, there is no such thing as a purely capitalist system. We do have some aspects of socialized systems as well, although they are very limited in the US today. So let's start with capitalism. What exactly is it? Well, we can define capitalism as a system of production and consumption of goods and services based on private ownership of resources and hired employment that is organized for market distribution. Now that is a really complicated multi-part definition. So let me break it down to help you see what are some of the key elements. Well, one thing to note is that first line, a system of production and consumption of goods and services, that is simply what is an economic system. So the rest of this is characterizing what that economic system is based upon. And the first thing to notice about that basis is that resources and means of production are privately owned and controlled. We're going to return to this point as we kick off our next class because this is actually perhaps the most central element in understanding what capitalism is and how it operates. But a few other important hallmarks of capitalism, particularly modern day capitalism, are that production is organized for the market. Things are produced to be bought, sold, and traded. They are not produced to be consumed directly by the producers themselves. And a third major hallmark is that workers are hired from a labor market to work as employees. So these workers are not owned by their employers, that would be slavery, but likewise, they don't own the resources with which they work. Now, proponents of capitalism argue that capitalism does three major things. They argue that capitalism allows for the greatest amount of freedom, in that in the market, everyone can pursue their own interests. They argue that capitalism creates the most economic prosperity of any economic system, and does so for the most people. And they argue that capitalism is self-regulating and will eventually work out most of its problems. The best products will emerge at the lowest cost, given enough time in a free market, so the argument goes. However, the ideal and the reality are in this case very far removed from each other. In actuality, capitalism perpetuates a host of class-based inequalities and oppressions. It can sometimes be incredibly inefficient and at times even fail to provide for needed goods. And left unregulated, capitalism creates significant threats to true democratic freedoms. Now, these are some bold claims, and I recognize that. And if you want to see how I'm going to back them up, well, you're just going to have to come to our next class. We will start by looking at some of the mechanisms by which capitalism operates, and then we'll explore these three critiques that I've just raised and examine some specific examples that show how these mechanisms lead to these negative outcomes. And we'll close out our class by exploring a few of the socialized aspects of our economy and considering what impacts in those arenas we can see.